Hi, welcome to Because. I'm your host, Mark Zyla. On this episode of Because, we hear the becauses of composer and multi-instrumentalist Chris Dudley. Dudley is most known for his work as the keyboardist in multi-Grammy Award-nominated band Under Oath. After almost 2 decades and over 1 million albums sold, Chris is finally bringing his unique ear and style to the film scoring world in a way that's already leaving a prominent mark. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Thanks so much for coming on today, Chris. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Excellent. Well, let's start at the beginning for you and your musical journey. What do those early years of your life look like? Where are you from? And how does kind of music get involved in your life?
My house was very, we consumed a lot of music in our house. The extent of musicians in my house was basically none. But my dad, my older brother, my mom were, when I was younger, like single digits, there's always music going on, like my mom listened to, a lot of like Aretha Franklin and Creedence Clearwater, but then my dad was into like, Dire Straits and AC/DC and stuff like that. And then my brother was on this whole other end where he was listening to a lot of like, 90s, late 80s, early 90s hip hop. But then also like, listening to Metallica and stuff. So I was exposed to a lot of music growing up. But it's, interesting looking back on it that the idea of playing it was just such a foreign thing. It was like, oh, we consume music in this house. Yeah, that's what it is,
Mm-hmm.
And and then we ended up moving. My parents got divorced when I was 9. We lived in California until I was 9.
Mm-hmm.
And then we moved to Florida, this little small town in Florida called Williston. There was like less than 3,000 people in the whole town. Like if you think like cow pasture raising town, like that's where I grew up.
Well, we know all about it here in the Quad Cities. We're on the Iowa-Illinois border. So
yeah, so you've got it.
Yep.
So, it wasn't really until I moved to Florida that I started really getting my own sense of, my own musical taste. I think that probably has a lot to do with the age as well, because I feel like when you're in your single digits, you're kind of just listening to either whatever your parents are listening to or whatever your, whatever your friends are listening to or whatever you happen to have, if you hear something on the radio, like you haven't really developed that taste. But
what years were these? Because for me, I'm thinking about the bus ride, and this was still in like CD player days with the like headphone splitter, and your friend got a headphone splitter so everybody could put an earbud in or something like that.
Yeah. So for me, this was probably, I think we moved to Florida in 92.
Okay.
So I was, right about that time.
The tape CD generation.
Yeah. Lots of tapes. I had my little carrier of tapes I would try to drag with me places. But
do you remember the first one you bought with your own money?
The first tape I bought with my own money was Vanilla Ice to the Extreme, which is pretty sick. So, yeah.
Still repping it hard today.
Yeah, and it's funny because I remember the first CD I bought with my own money. I bought 2 at once. I'll never forget this. And I think this kind of goes to show the wild swings of musical taste in my house. So I, at the same time, really wanted Pantera, Great Southern Trendkill. It was right when that came out. I think it was in 95.
Right.
And then I think it was 95. And then Celine Dion, Let's Talk About Love. I went to Blockbuster Music and had my own money, and I slapped them both up on the counter, and I was like, these are the 2 CDs I want. So
These are for me.
yeah, both of them.
Right.
Yeah. So, it was, it was really like, in the early mid 90s that I really started getting my own sense of what I liked and what I didn't like. But also, that being said, growing up in a small town, you're not really exposed to a ton. So, I was thankful that I had friends in my middle school and high school that were, very adventurous with their music and, were finding stuff that normally I wouldn't have been exposed to. So,
oh, for sure. Well, let's talk a little bit about that, musical community, I guess. These are friends introducing you to music. You're sharing music with them. And I have to imagine that it's that soup of people there that starts to get you into maybe becoming a performer of music in a certain respect. So what's the story behind that?
So, really, I guess that would be fast forwarding to, early high school. So this was it'd be 97-ish.
Mm-hmm.
I was, I liked heavy music a lot, but again, being in a small town, there, there's not a music scene. There's not, really a way to find real heavy music, but it sounds silly going back to it, like looking back, but there was the first Mortal Kombat movie that came out,
Mm-hmm.
and the soundtrack to that movie had Fear Factory, Napalm Death, Typo Negative, Sister Machine Gun, like all these like legit bands on it. And I bought that soundtrack, and I was like, and this was in middle school that I had bought that.
Right.
And I was just like, oh my gosh, like whatever this music is, like that's what I want. So I just went out and bought the CDs or the tapes of the bands that were on the soundtrack, but I didn't really have any other scope of what heavy music could be. I loved film music and I loved heavy music. Like those are basically my two things. And I was in freshman year of high school, and I had to take an elective, and guitar was an elective. I could take a guitar class, and I was like,
cool.
That's me. Like I want to, I want to be hanging out with all the cool kids playing guitar.
Right.
And, they gave us an acoustic guitar in class. So like, I was like, oh, I can't play heavy music with this lame. But the first day of guitar class, there was a kid in the class with me. He was sitting on the other side of the room, and he had a shirt on for a band. I could tell it was a heavy band because of the shirt, but I didn't know who it was. But I was like, that's the dude I want to be hanging out with. So I literally, because he wore this shirt, I went and sat down next to him, introduced myself, and asked him about his shirt. And I obviously, like when you're in high school, if somebody's asking you like, yo, what's your shirt about? You automatically are just like, oh, this is like the coolest band ever, blah, blah, blah. So he starts telling me about this band. It was this band called Overthrow. They're not, they were like a small Florida band at the time, but he would, go to local, not to my town, but like Tampa. He would drive to Tampa. He would go to like shows down there.
Right.
So he introduced me to, the fact that there's a pseudo local music scene, which in my town I had no idea. And he was like, oh, you got to go down to Tampa or St. Petersburg or whatever. And I was like, yo, can you like make me like a CD or a tape or something? Cause I would love to hear some stuff. And he did. He made me a whole mixtape just full of stuff that he thought I would like based on the bands that I liked.
Wow.
And he was like, oh yeah, like, me and my friend started a band, and, we're, just playing heavy music, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, like I would love to check it out. So, I did. And I loved it. I was like, oh, this is cool. Like people playing music. And I played guitar at the time, but I didn't really consider myself like a real musician.
Right.
And that band was called Under Oath. And I was, I thought it was cool. I mean, because it's just high school friends playing music. I was like, oh, cool, like high school band. And then fast forward like 8 months or so, and they're looking to get a keyboard player, and I was just kind of always around. So they were like, hey, do you want to come play keyboard in our band? And I was like, well, I can play guitar, so I guess keyboard's not really too far off from that. So I said yes, and fast forward 20 something years later, and that's still what I'm doing. So.
That's amazing. So who was that person in class?
That was our old singer Dallas.
Okay, yeah, from Under Oath, Maylene and the Sons of Disaster, etc. Very cool.
Yeah, great dude. And it's funny how you can look back on meeting a person and realize how there are certain people that when you met them, it completely changed the trajectory of your life. And I can look back on that first day of guitar class, and I'm like, I think back like, man, if he was wearing a different shirt, like what if he was just wearing a black t-shirt? Like I would have never gone over and sat down next to him and introduced myself. And, you know, it's kind of like that whole like butterfly effect thing where I'm like, man, like when he was putting on that shirt in the morning, he had no idea he was about to completely change the trajectory of a guy's life, you know?
For sure.
And it's wild to think about.
And, you know, to think that also you were ready to see that shirt because you had those experiences with that Mortal Kombat soundtrack and the various things that you've been hearing from other friends and older brother, right?
My older brother, yes.
Yeah. Older brothers are big for musical tastes.
100%. Like I got a lot of, now looking back, I realized that I got a lot of my musical taste from my brother. So it's cool. Good and bad.
Mine was my brother was tired of hearing me listen to the same few Korn songs over and over again. So he brought in a Earth Crisis CD.
Oh, hell yeah.
And I was like, okay, all right.
Like, yo, this is heavy.
This is heavy. And I never looked back.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up Korn because my brother, when I was probably like I think I was probably 12 or 13. Mm-hmm. He was moving out of our house and he left his Alice in Chains Dirt album at the house. Like he forgot to take it with him. Mm-hmm. And so I just kind of grabbed it and brought it into my room and I was just like, what is this? And my mom, she was not having it. She was like, that's evil. Like you can't listen to that. And she took it from me and I was determined to find it. So I ended up buying it again and just kind of listening to it on the sly. But it's funny because fast forward like 20 years from there, we did a tour. It was the last tour that we did right before COVID hit. It was us, Alice in Chains, and Korn. And I was hanging out with the Alice in Chains guys, and I was telling them about that story. I was like, yeah, my mom like took my album, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. And I was talking to Sean, and he's like, hey, like we should take a picture and send it to your mom. And so I sent it to her. I was like, hey, mom, I'm being brought over to the dark side. And it was, it was funny, but yeah.
I'm sure in that era, there's a whole entire like sales metric for repurchasing of CDs that parents had taken away.
Yeah, that's a whole weird thing that I just, as a parent of a teenager currently, I still don't understand. Like there are things that our kids are allowed to listen to. There are some things they're not allowed to listen to, but it's not like super hardcore to where it's like, oh, I'm gonna break this thing. It's like, hey, like maybe not the Cardi B album. Like, how about the Taylor Swift album? Like, is she saying curse words? Yeah, but it's fine, you know? And yeah, that whole thing, particularly because, my growing up in like a household where my mom was like, oh, like there's evil music and there's good music. Like that was a whole weird dynamic as well. So yeah.
Right. Well, there's shades of that in music history abound, with certain intervals being outlawed by the church in the early times because that was the devil's tritone and
that's
stuff, so.
That is still a thing which blows my mind. I saw a video online the other day of a guy talking about how if you've got like a straight 4/4 beat, that's okay. God's cool with that. But then once you start, if you bring in like a polyrhythm, like on the drums, that's where it opens the door for the devil. And I'm like, yo, are you serious? Like, I mean, different strokes, I guess, but yeah,
Right.
not for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just
So
asked my kids, let's not blare WAP in the house. Like,
right.
please, like that would be great. Let's not have that.
Dial that down a little
Yeah.
bit. So, we're wrapping up kind of this first part of your musical life, and wondering if we've missed anything in terms of your connection to film music. Like, what were some of those early soundtracks that you mentioned that you had a love for both heavy music and for film music? And, foreshadowing, that's going to be a mixture of your life. So,
Yeah.
talk to me a little bit about that early film music. What hooked you, and what were maybe some favorites?
So, the first score that I really took notice of, where I was like, oh, like, and I think it has to do with the age that I was when I heard it and when I saw the film, because there were so many other films that I had seen where I only realized looking back how important the score was to my experience and my memory of that. Because if you look really, like, most early John Williams scores, it's like you look
Right.
at like Jurassic Park and Star Wars and things like that, you recognize how important those scores are. But at the time, it didn't register with me. I was just like, oh, this movie is amazing, but the music was just another part of the film.
Right.
But when I went and saw Titanic, James Horner's score for that, I remember the first time I watched it and thinking, like, I've never realized how important the score is to the tone of a film. And that score, it has a bit of a reputation because on the album for the score has the Celine Dion song on it. And that Celine Dion song, obviously, at the time was just the most overplayed, like, crazy thing ever.
Right.
But the score itself, I bought that on CD and I listened to it every day. Like, I love that score so much. And that was the first time where I was like, oh, like, this is like an art, and this is something that I don't understand. But even at the time, it wasn't like, oh, I wonder how you do that. I wonder if I could do that. It was literally just me like, oh, I like that music, I'm going to buy it, and yeah, so that was the first time that I really took notice of what a score could do, and it really affected me. And then later on there were there's a particular movie that I saw that really, like, I was like, oh, I'm going to do that, but the that was the first thing.
Right. Wow. So let's move into kind of the beginnings of your, I would say, career, because I imagine these first few years of Under Oath didn't feel like a career or had that type of scope to it. So,
No.
and I know that for artistic people, or for people who like to create, it's often hard to get started, right? And so I like to talk about these, like, early years, because I don't know, my first band, maybe the first year, we sucked.
Everybody's band does, yeah.
So let's hear about those years with Under Oath.
Well, again, we were just kids in high school. So, it wasn't even that we had aspirations to have a career as musicians. We didn't have aspirations to be a big band, because it was similar to what I was talking about earlier when I was growing up, there being this idea of like, oh, there are people who make music, and then there's us. It's similar to, most people, when you watch movies, it's not like, I want to do that. It's just, man, I love movies. Like, that's
Right.
a great movie. Like, that's an awesome movie. So for us, there was what we were doing in high school, playing our little shows in front of nobody. We had a demo tape, etc.
Right.
And then there were what big bands did, like we would see, bands on MTV and stuff like that. And we're just like, there was never a thought that, like, oh, maybe there's somewhere where this could come together and we could do that. It was just so separate.
Right. Or somewhere even in between.
Yeah.
Where,
It was, that was not even a thought,
Right.
So I think because of that, we continued to go and write and play shows in front of nobody just because it was something that we loved to do, you know?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And as the years went on and, we were, starting to get out of high school, there was more touring, obviously, because, we had more time to tour, because normally we were in high school, so we could play on the weekends.
Right.
We could play, during the
School
summer
breaks.
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So once we got out of high school, we're like, oh, like we can like try to tour more. And, we weren't making any money. Like we were paying to tour for the most part.
Right.
But then there was, there's a point in time where, dudes were getting out of high school, and it was like, do I want to be doing this?
Right.
Like, do I want to be going to college? Like, because obviously getting out of high school is a very important time when you're figuring out what it is you want to do with your life. But it's funny because there, a bunch of us were just kind of like, oh, well, we'll figure that out, but we're just going to play music for now,
Mm-hmm.
And so we had some member changes. I'm kind of like blowing through a lot of like details, but we had some member changes, and right around 2000, the end of 2002, in the beginning of 2003, we were getting on like tours where we were not paying to go on them, and we're like, oh, like we can play and not like quote unquote make money, but it's like, oh, like I'm coming home with something, whether it's like I'm leaving for 4 weeks and I'm coming home with like $75. It's like I'm not in the black coming
Right.
home.
Like you had lived for 4 weeks and you came home with money.
Yes, exactly. And we had come to a point where we were all kind of seeing like, hey, like, we're all in our, if we're not in our 20s yet, we were close, some of us.
Mm-hmm.
And we were like, we should kind of take a step back and be like, what are we wanting to do here,
Mm-hmm.
And I remember we had a thing where we told ourselves that we were going to like give it everything we had for a period of time. And if we saw general growth and like a something where it's like, hey, like maybe this could continue and get better, and we only have to take off our real jobs like a month here, or like we could figure something out to where this makes sense, then we would continue to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And we did that, and we had a nationwide tour that we did at that point. And we came home with more money than the tour before that.
Mm-hmm.
And we were like, dang, like maybe we could continue to do this. And then we put out, we got on the Warped Tour, which, it was like a summer, an entire summer that we got.
I was there.
Yeah. And we were, not really making a whole lot of money, but again, we're like, hey, like something could be happening here. And then toward the beginning of that tour, we put out an album of ours called They're Only Chasing Safety. And that was really the big turning point. That was the thing where we're at the beginning of the tour, we were playing in front of nobody on like a side stage. And then after that album came out, our shows just were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we kind of saw that like, wow, like something's, because normally what happens is your album comes out, it sells an amount of records the first week,
right,
and then it just tapers off after that. And
Mm-hmm.
what we saw is we had sold what we were hoping to sell in the first week. Like our goal, we were like, oh, what if we sold, because we knew that we were on the same label as this band called Further Seems Forever, which we love that band. And we were like, if we could ever sell the same amount of records first week as Further Seems Forever, we will have made it. And we did. We like hit that mark, and we were just like, oh, amazing. But then it didn't go down. Like it was just steady, like every week. It wasn't a thing where it's like it shot to the moon and we were just like massive. It was just an every week thing where there was like this steady growth. And by the end of that tour, we were like, we weren't able to move stages, but our the crowds for our stage were so big that the small PA on our stage just didn't make it, was like comical to look at. And that was really the point where we were like, oh, like this might be our job. Like our band might be our job, because up until that point, our girlfriends were like, paying our cell phone bills, or like, we were all taking like odd jobs when we were at home.
Right.
And yeah, so that was the point where we were like, oh, this might turn into something. And then it did,
Mhm.
which is crazy.
So there's a couple things I want to loop back to. First is that first album, and the way I was introduced to Under Oath was I'm from Parkersburg, West Virginia, which has an actual really great kind of underground music scene.
Mm-hmm.
The band Zayo was started there.
Yeah.
And so my literal first show, which this is foreshadowing to maybe the third part of this interview, but my first show, I snuck out of my parents' house, walked down the street to a YWCA where Jesse Smith had rented out, and put on a Zayo show. And so my first show ever was a Zayo show that I snuck out of my house to go see when I was like 10.
Funny story is my first show with Under Oath was with Zayo.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So yeah, small world.
It is a small world. And but as it relates to Under Oath, there was a DVD that came out, and I think it was called X Done X, and it had a bunch of I think it was like all solid state bands, and y'all's first music video I think was on there. And I've been dying to ask, is the location of that video at Sloss Furnace?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you watch that video, it was all shot there. We shot it all in one day, and like the end, there's this whole part where we're just like basically just like beating the hell out of each other and playing, and that's right where they set up the merch at for Furnace Fest.
Oh, nice.
Which is super super fun.
Yeah, there was also a really great Poison the Well video on there too, I remember.
Yeah, because that DVD was all the that director. It was basically just his music videos. His name is Darren Doan, and he's great dude. He put up with a lot with us that day.
So last question I want to talk to you about this transition period into doing music as a profession. What were those conversations like with your mom? with parental units, in terms of like, hey, this is starting to kind of work, and I need you to trust me that I'm going to be okay.
Man, I gotta say, if you want to have a career as a creative, you could not have better parents than mine. Mm-hmm. My parents were the most supportive, still are, but like there was a point in time where, again, this is back when we were making no money, we were paying to go on tour, where our trailer axle broke on our trailer that we hooked up to our minivan.
Right.
And so we were going to borrow a friend's trailer from another like local band. They didn't have a trailer we could borrow. So we got to a point where we were like, all right, well, we're not going to have a trailer now because we couldn't afford to even rent one at the time. Mm-hmm. So we're just going to have to stay home. We're like, well, I guess we can't do the tour. My parents go out and buy us this brand new dual axle trailer. And they're like, we don't want you to miss this tour. Like this seems like it could be really cool. And it was like a $3,500 trailer, like really nice. Mm-hmm. They just went out and bought it for us just because.
So it's worth more than the minivan, probably.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, for sure. And it's wild now being the parent of a teenager and thinking about what my mom was cool with, and it's not in like a irresponsible way. Like she was the exact opposite of just like yeah, whatever, do whatever you want. Like she was very involved in everything. But the idea that my first US tour that we did, it was a month long, over a month. It was a month and a half, and I was 16 years old.
Wow.
And she allowed me to go in a van with these other kids and travel. Like we went from Florida to Washington State and everywhere in between in a van that barely ran. And the idea that they were just like, yeah, like we think this is a good experience for you is amazing. But also as a parent, I'm like, man, I honestly don't know what I would think about that. Granted, my teenager's a girl, so I would feel differently about that. But yeah, there wasn't even like discussions with my parents about, hey, I think we're going to try to do this as a career. It was literally just, I'd be calling my mom whenever something crazy cool would happen. And I'm like, Mom, you'll never believe like who watched our set today, or you're never going to believe like how big our show was today. And it was literally just like that's amazing. We're so happy, blah, blah,
Wow.
blah. So we never even had to broach it, a thing of like, hey, like, I think this might be my career, because I'd never done anything different. So it was literally just, hey, this thing I've always done, we're like being like successful, quote unquote, like from a worldly standpoint, we're like being successful because we're selling tickets, we're, going on big tours. So yeah, it was never even broached. It was just my parents in the background, always just saying, go for it. You got it. Like, you can do it, and even when I didn't even think I was trying to like, quote unquote, make it or do it, they were just
Right.
like, yeah, go for it. So, they did encourage me to go to college out of high school just to get some sort of a degree for something to fall back on. I decided not to, and they didn't push it. Like, they weren't like, you need to. It was like, hey, we think this is the best thing, but you're an adult. You can do whatever you want,
Right.
So, yeah.
Since we're at this point in the story in terms of timeline, I wanted you to talk a little bit about they're only chasing safety within the lens of that album meant a lot to a lot of people, including myself. And at the time it came out, it was like an album that you could throw on in the car with your friends, and like you knew every single song. It was like a great sing-along record. I listen back to it now, removed from that time period in my life, and it like instantly puts me back there.
Yeah.
And so what is it like for you as a person who helped create that? Like, what does that mean to you, that this thing, not only did it perform, as a thing that was sold and it helped launch y'all's career, but that album, man, like it just means so much to so many people. And I have to imagine that's kind of a humbling or a strange kind of feeling for somebody.
Yeah. It's cool for me because I think back to the albums that were that for me, and this sounds like the most douchebag thing ever to say, but like I've been able to talk to all of the musicians who created albums that were that for me, like the albums that shaped who I am, the albums that instantly take me back to a period of time. I've been able to talk to all of those musicians and tell them that and say like, hey, like your album changed my view of music, blah, blah, blah. And knowing that ours was also that album for other people, for me, I what I usually say is I get it. Like, what, because a lot of times when I meet these other musicians, I always want to be like, no, you don't understand. Like, your album was so important. But and I realize that I don't usually have the words to be able to express it. But
Right.
so when somebody like you says like, hey, like that album, like I just respond with, I know what that type of album is. And the fact that we made one of those or two of those or five of those for whoever, that's really cool because I understand the impact that an album like that can have. And, it's been really cool, because, depending on who you talk to, it's different albums sometimes, but the fact that we've created music that means that much to anybody, is, yeah, it's wild, and, but at the same time, I try not to really think about it, because it's not a thing where I'm like, I'm sitting back and like, man, like, how many people's lives did we just
Yeah.
change, bro? It's more so like, you know, we're all like late 30s, early 40s now, and it's like we're still making music together. And for us, it's like we've always done the same thing. Like when we get into a room, we're like, let's write something that just like excites us, you know?
Right.
And so in that aspect, it's like, well, we were doing that then, we're doing it now, we've done it, you know, in between. And it's for us, it's always like, oh, I wonder how this will be viewed by people, you know, because for us, it's just been the same thing. It's like, we haven't changed anything we've done. You know, back then it was, you know, like you were saying, there was that video that you saw, and it was on that other the Changing of Times record. And you know, after that record, we toured with a ton of like mega heavy bands, and we were just like, oh, we don't want to do that. We want it to be a little more melodic. And then, you know, so we then after Only Chasing Safety came out, we were touring with all these like super melodic bands. We're like, oh, we want to do like a heavy record. And like, we're always just unconsciously like going against what would probably be smart career advice if you were looking at it objectively.
Just write that album again.
Yes.
People want that.
Exactly. Right. And so that's, I think, the biggest thing where I look at it and I'm like, yeah, we're still doing the exact same thing. We don't really intend on doing it, but we're like, yeah, let's just like do the opposite of the smart thing. And like, hopefully people think it's cool, you know?
Right. No doubt. So, it was like, so I was touring with my band at the time between, They're Only Chasing Safety and Define the Great Line. And I remember there being like two things that were coming out. It was Define the Great Line and, I should have looked it up beforehand. But the most recent release from, it's a pop punk band, and they're huge. Their singer's name is Kenny.
Oh, the Starting Line.
Starting Line.
Yes.
I can't believe I couldn't think of the Starting Line.
Yeah, no, great dudes.
But like those two albums, man, I was like at this time where I'm living in a van playing metal with my friend Jeff that you now know.
Yeah.
And I'm like in that back, we had a 15 passenger van, and luckily we had the trailer so we could keep all of the seats in, and everybody would try to get that last row because it was like a full body body bench. But I'm back there like trying to figure out what I want to do with my life, because like I love being on the road, being with my friends doing this, but like not making money. And I have like the opportunity to, you know, get a master's degree in French horn performance. And so I'm like in the back of this van, like listening to Beethoven 9, also like listening to Define the Great Line and this Starting Line record. And it was like, to me, this kind of a perfect scene of who I am as a person, where it's just like, I love all this stuff and I just don't have enough time to do literally everything. And
I feel that.
Well, let's kind of, you know, move through the Under Oath story a little bit more, and then let's get into your film composing. So you guys went on a hiatus for a little while. Can you talk a little bit about maybe like the creative reasoning for that, you know, and what this kind of, to me at least, it seems like you guys are like almost relaunching with a ton of things going on. And I'm kind of curious how a band that's been together this long kind of weathers that, what these conversations look like, and then, you know, coming to this new era where it seems like there's this almost 2002 energy behind it again.
Yeah. Well, just to I guess to clarify, like we just broke up. Like we didn't. At the time, we were all convinced that we were never going to play together again. Like, we had kind of come to a point where, you know, like I said, you know, we've been doing this since high school, nonstop. And we got to a point in our lives where half the band had multiple kids. Right. And our band had always been like, you know, we're road dogs balls to the wall. Like, we are going to give this band everything. And because we grew up on the road and because we were a live band, we at the time viewed it as, if we are not touring as much as we can, then we are not giving this the amount of effort that it deserves to have.
Mhm.
And it got to a point where, particularly me and our guitar player James and our guitar player Tim, all three of us had multiple kids at the time.
Mhm.
And we were like, well, if it's going to be a choice between the band continuing to be successful and us being present dads, then we're going to be present dads. Like, we're going to be home with our kids, and,
Right.
and none of us had any, there's no big dilemma with like, well, what else am I going to do? Cause there's just I think there's a shift that comes in your brain when you have kids where you're just like, hey, like, I'll figure it out because they're what's most important,
Right.
And, so we broke up because, looking back, it's like, it's silly because the idea of saying, hey, is there a smarter way that we can do this to where we can still do it, still enjoy it, and be at home with our kids? Like, that was never really like a thought. It was like, hey, we're not able to give it the quote unquote energy and attention that it needs, so we're gonna call it.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward a couple years, it was almost 4 years, I think, and we were coming up on a 10-year anniversary of an album of They're Only Chasing Safety, or sorry,
Mhm.
on 10-year anniversary of Define the Great Line was coming up.
Right.
And we were still on like a group text with everyone, just like normally, just sending like dumb gifts back and forth and whatnot.
Mhm.
But somebody had brought up the idea of, hey, what if we played a show? Like, what if we played Define the Great Line at home in Tampa, just as like a celebration sort of thing?
Mhm.
Very long story short is that snowballed into, oh, well, we never did anything for the 10-year anniversary of They're Only Chasing Safety because we've been broken up. So maybe we could play both albums. And then it went to, well, what if we did like a whole weekend? And then it went to like, well, what if we did like a short tour? And then we ended up doing like an entire tour on that. Like, we all had different projects going on, different jobs, etc. And we were just like, hey, how much time can we get off to do this tour? And that was how we booked it.
Wow.
And yeah, and then it was about halfway through that tour where we were like, we're all a few years older, and we hadn't really been around each other as much. And we were like, hey, is there maybe a way that we can do this, but in a way to where it doesn't feel like we're having to do it, because toward the end, like before we broke up, like, I always say that it felt like Under Oath was just like this machine, and it was like you write an album, record an album, you hit the road for 2 years, you come home, you write an album, you record an album, you hit the road for 2 years, and like, it was just there was never an option to do anything else. And
Right.
not that I'm like, it's like, oh, woe is me, creative hell, but it was like, it had just gotten to a point where I can say I felt like I didn't really enjoy writing because I always saw it as like something that was coming at me. It's like, we're like halfway through an album cycle, and I'm like, man, we're going to have to do another album. And like, that's going to be daunting.
Right.
So when we broke up, I didn't touch an instrument for over a year. Like, I threw out most of my equipment at the last show because I was like, I don't need this stuff anymore. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going to be at home with my kids.
Mhm.
And then turns out that was not the case. But yeah, I didn't touch anything for over a year. Just because I think we all, in hindsight, you ask, how is it that a band that's been going for as long as yours has, like, how do you keep it going, etc. But I think that we needed that time apart. We needed the time for us to be able to recognize, like, oh, like, this is something we get to do. Like, this isn't
Right.
something we have to do. Like, I think once we all realize, like, oh, we don't have to do this. Like, we can all go and do other things. then it was like, man, like this is a special thing that we get to do together. We should try to figure out how that can be. And we did. And I'm super thankful for that.
Well, let's talk about you as a film composer. How does one get started in that, or at least within your story? About when did this? You mentioned that you see things as kind of two things. It's like people make that, and I'm a consumer of that.
Yes.
And now you have switched that as it relates to film. How did that happen?
So, it started as, just an extension of my love of movies and love of film music. I'll never forget. I went and we were on tour and we had a day off, and all the guys wanted to go see Hot Rod because Hot Rod was in the theater at the time. And I had no desire to see that movie. And we were on tour with Amber Lynn. And me and Amber Lynn's merch guy were the only two guys that didn't want to go see it. So we went and saw this movie called Sunshine that Danny Boyle directed. Mm-hmm. We didn't know anything about it. I just knew, it's the guy that directed 28 Days Later. He's got a space movie. Let's go see it. Mm-hmm. And I walked out of that with my mind blown. And the score of that movie just bowled me over. I was like, that is what I want to do that one day, this was back in, I think it was like 2008. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I want to do that one day. But then I want to do that one day turned into literal years of me hearing film scores, watching film, and just continually being like, oh man, that would be awesome to do one day. That would be so cool. Like I would love to do that. Mm-hmm. But then nothing after that statement. And then one night, me and my wife are laying in bed watching a movie, and I don't remember what movie it was, but I made that comment again. I was like, "Oh man, that score is great." I'd love to be able to do that one day. And being the wise wife and all of that, she was like, "Why are you not pursuing this? Why are you not doing it? Like seriously?" And I gave her all the reasons, there were a lot of them there. I didn't have any connections. I've never scored a film. There's so much about orchestration that I don't understand. That like the learning curve is so steep. And I was just like, that's something that other people do. Right. And, she was like, well, why don't you just say that you're doing it and then see what happens? Like, just put it out there, Mm-hmm. So what I did after that is, I was like, okay, maybe that's not a bad place to start. So what I did is I put a thing up on my social media accounts saying that I was opening up my studio for writing projects. And if anybody wanted to have me write on their album, or if there's a video game or a short film or a movie or whatever, like, please get in touch. And it was just kind of like a Hail Mary, like, oh, I wonder if anybody's going to contact me. Right. And somebody did. I had it was a friend of mine who, we kind of grew up together in Florida, and he had moved out to LA to, become an actor. And he was like, oh, hey, I'm working on this. I'm writing and directing this short. We've got no money. Do you want to score it? And I was like, yeah, like, let's do it. So that's where my learning curve started, where I was like, all right, I got to figure out how to do this. It was, I got a YouTube premium subscription so that I could watch every YouTube video I could think of about how to do this. I, reached out to a couple people that I knew some stuff, and just started becoming a sponge for information, really. Mm-hmm. And I kind of had some assurance, a little bit of assurance, because I knew that John Murphy, the guy that composed Sunshine, that movie that blew my brain to pieces, he was just in a rock band, and he decided he wanted to score movies, and like that's how he got started. And same with Danny Elfman, like right. He was just in a rock band, like, oh, like what if I like worked on a movie? So I knew that there was a path. Mm-hmm. So as unlikely of a path as it was, I was like, well, it could happen. So let me just like run toward it, you know?
Right.
And it was a snowball from there. You know, it was that industry story that you always hear where it's like, you know, whatever industry it is, it's like, well, how did you get to where you are? It's like, oh, well, I worked on this thing, and then there was this person who was working on it who went on to do this, and they're like, oh, you know who would be cool for this? Chris would be cool for this. So why don't you have a meeting? Blah, blah, blah. So yeah, it was just a lot of snowballs of, you know, people working on other things, and then me being in, you know, in people's conversations about their projects, and, you know, again, you know, not making a lot or any money, but like my goal was just like, I'm not trying to make money right now. I'm just trying to do stuff. So as long as every project I'm doing, I'm just earning a little bit more than I did on the one before it, like, and there's an upward trajectory, like that's really all I'm looking for. So yeah, mega thankful. I mean, it's been, I'm still trying to figure it out. You know, it's been, you know, I'm like half a decade now into doing this, but I'm still like, you know, learning every day and like trying to plug knowledge holes that I have. But it's a lot, man. It's yeah, there's a lot to it.
So I think the learning thing there for other creative people is that there probably isn't a project too small to consider for your first project on something you're interested in.
Never. And what's good also is, you know, I've got a handful of directors that, you know, I've worked with on like small projects, like for no money, but then those people go on to do bigger projects, you know?
Right.
And, you know, I've heard that sort of advice given to, you know, a ton of people in creative circles where it's like, work with your friends, like make things for no money. Like, cause if you're constantly creating and you're constantly working with people, other people who are doing creative things, like, you know, at some point, like there's projects that are going to come up where it's like, oh, like John that made this like little short film, like he got a budget for like a low budget film, like, hey, like, and then he's going to bring along his crew. And, you know, that's a legit thing, you know, you just make stuff with your friends. Like that's such a huge part of it, you know, like I said, that the first guy that ever hit me up was a friend of mine from Florida. And I've now scored, because he's a director now, I've now scored 2 of his features, and we're working on the 3rd right now. And, you know, every project is bigger than the one before it. And he's great. He's a great writer, great director. And like, you know, we get to make stuff together. And, but all of that started with just him being like, hey, I've got no money, but remember we used to go to hardcore shows? You want to score this thing? I'm like, hell yeah, let's go, you know?
Right. That's awesome. So let's start to wrap it up a little bit and bring it to present day. What does it look like for you managing this ecosystem of creative projects, in terms of you're about to hit the road on a, I don't know how many month tour with Loathe and Periphery, and how are you planning to keep your other creative projects going while you're on the road?
If you can figure it out and let me know, that would be that'd be great. No, it's a lot. I got to be honest, like, but I'm in a position where, you know, being a career creative is just so much of it is building the bridge as the train's going across it. You know, just like saying yes to things and then, you know, figuring out how to do them later. You know, I've got 3 kids, I've got a wife, like I've got a mortgage, like, you know, just from a career perspective, like I gotta pay the bills. So, you know, I don't have an option to not work it out. And I think that is a great thing in general, whether it's a deadline that you have that's externally imposed on you, where it's like, hey, you have to get this done by this time, or a self-imposed limitation on yourself, where it's like, well, I don't have a choice but to do this. So, you know, as it relates logistically to everything I have going on now, you know, I've got all of this setup that I have here, my whole studio, I've condensed down to a road case basically. And I bring that on tour with Under Oath. And if I am doing a film during an Under Oath tour, which has been the last 3 Under Oath tours I've been working on movies during the time, I have to get to a city. I have to set my alarm to wake up in the morning, which is not normal on tour.
Right.
And then I have to try to find a quiet place to set up my studio, whether that's a room in the venue that's not being used or getting a hotel room for the day or what.
Mm-hmm.
And then I wake up, I get coffee, I go and I work on my film until our sound check. I do our sound check. I do our like meet and greet and all that. I go back to my hotel room or whatever room this is where I'm working. And then I work on the film until showtime ish. I come back to the venue, play the show. And then usually that's the end of my day. And then I'll hang out after the show until usually, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. And then I go to sleep and wake up and do it again the next day. So it makes touring less fun but also
Right.
just way more productive because so much of being on tour is just waiting. Like it's okay. I woke up, it's 11 a.m. I don't have to do anything until 6 p.m. Like I literally don't have a responsibility. So like I would prefer to be busy and getting something done than just sitting there on my phone being like, I wonder if there's like go watch a movie or something. And days like that are good. And I do take days off on tour, but it's it's a lot. Like I have a short that I just finished up. And then I have a feature that I'm in the middle of right now, but that feature is going to take me through the Under Oath tour. So I was hoping to not be working on a film on this tour, but it's not gonna happen. So, but then there's also the element of balancing family time and all that, and
Right.
home time, and time with friends, and like trying not to like lose those relationships. And I'm still just trying to figure it out as I go along. But I've got things that are working now, and again, a lot of that is thanks to having a wise wife, and
Mm-hmm.
her kind of being like, hey, I see this, here's what I think you need to do. And I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, you need to have office hours, like, because you're killing yourself. I'm like, oh yeah, that might not be a bad
That's
idea.
smart.
So yeah.
For my wife, it's always the big story was I didn't want to go and take the audition here for the Quad City Symphony while I was doing my doctorate at University of Illinois. And when we talk about stories that change your life, she was like, well, what are you going to do today? And I was like, I don't know, play video games. And she's like, well, how about you go take that audition and then you come home and play video games for like the next 2 days? And I was like, oh, that sounds awesome. Well, took the audition and it changed my life because I'd never heard of the Quad Cities before.
Dude, that's
so,
just lives, man. You just
partners
gotta
will always give you the right answer.
You gotta just shut up and listen sometimes. Like, that happened, during COVID. My wife, it was toward the end of the really the lockdowns and all that, but my wife kind of had a sit down and she was like, this doesn't work. Like what you're doing does, because I was looking back on it, it's insane. But my schedule, I was starting at 9 a.m. I'd work on a project until it was going 9 to 6 on a project. And then I would take from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. off to like hang out with the family, have that be my family time. And then I work from 7 p.m. to 2 a.m. on my second project. And I did that I would say on average 7 days a week. Like I was probably taking like 1 or 2 days a month off, but I was doing that for 2.5 months, 3 months. And she was, she was like, this isn't working at all. Like you can't do that. And, thankfully I listened and I was like, yeah, I need to like have some more time to myself for you guys, etc. But yeah, sometimes it just takes somebody sitting you down to be like, yo, you're being an idiot. Like you need to knock it off.
Right.
Or you need to go do the thing, as in your instance.
Right. And you have that as well. You need to go do the thing, be a composer. Yeah. It's, I always like to use certain moments like that of this show to talk to other creative people and the allure of creative projects. Like I don't know about you, but for me, like when I'm really into something, like it's a whole body thing. Like I'm excited, like it's like an energy, it's an adrenaline that just keeps going. And for me, sometimes it even goes past the completion of the project when you get to see it out there in the world and all those types of things. But like what I often find is that when I am really, really focused on that and riding that like creative wave, the person that's left at the end of the day is not like, I can't give my best to my family. I can't give my best to my wife if I allow myself to kind of maniacally ride that creative wave. So,
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that. And, I think that has to do a lot with something I say a lot about for myself. And I think for a lot of other people, if they really think about it. But, when you look at motivation and you look at inspiration, that is something that I always say that motivation is kind of a trap. And if you're in a spot where you are wanting to get a project done, or you're wanting to work, you're wanting to be creative, but you're kind of waiting for your motivation and your inspiration, that's kind of, I always compare it to, you said a wave,
right.
I always compare it to like if you have a rowboat and you're trying to get across an ocean, when the wind does come, it's like put the sail up, like ride it. But when the wind dies down, if you just sit there and you wait for the wind to come again, you're never going to make it. You have to row the boat, and like
Right.
rowing the boat to me is like doing the work even when you're not inspired. It's like, well, I'm still going to write even if I don't feel like it,
Right.
And, it's kind of the same, but almost conversely, there are times when, after I've imposed these like limits on myself where I'm like, I'm not going to work, 16 hours a day, even if I'm like really inspired. Like if it's 9:00 at night, I'm hanging out with my wife and I've got this idea, I make a voice note on my phone and I put it away and then I address it the next day. Because to me,
Right.
it's about prioritizing, like, is it worth chasing that inspiration that hit just now and running out of the room, going to my studio and like laying it down? Or is it more important in the long run to say, hey, I'm going to spend this time with you, and I just need to trust that I can do the work when the time comes,
Right.
So,
Well, thank you so much for taking so much time today to chat with
of
us
course,
about
man.
your life and creativity. On a personal note, I appreciate it because, you as a member of a band have been an important part of my life. And so it's really cool that I get to sit here and chat with you about both that and yourself as an artist.
Yeah,
And
well,
the
thank you.
depths of
Yeah,
that. So.
and thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And hopefully, if we come on tour in your area, maybe we can go get coffee or something. Like
For sure.
like freaking adults that are
Yeah,
still creatives.
absolutely. Well, you will be in town in March. The East Moline date is here in the Quad Cities.
Oh well, yeah. Shoot me an email when it comes up to that. I'd love to get together.
For sure. Excellent. Because is produced by Mark Zyla and Jaron Michelle in the studios of WVIK Quad Cities NPR. Thank you for listening to this episode. Because I read Because by Mo Willems, illustrated by Amber Wren, I wanted to learn the becauses of people I admire. Do me a favor and thank someone in your own because story, and join us next time on Because.